Hi YouTube, Tim Judge here again. This is the next episode of Before Earth, an Odyssey begins, and the Kerbals have landed on the moon, and while there they set up a ground-based telescope and they discovered Minmus, which they never really noticed before because it's very small and faint. But it looks like a very rough surface with flat areas both at the bottom in these lime green flats, and some flat areas that form plateaus near the tops of mountains. And they decided that this looks like a fascinating place to see, and it also looks strangely like mint-flavored desserts. So Bill, Val, and Bob are going to fly by Minmus. And they're doing so on a delivery vehicle that was designed for rescuing Kerbals from high Kerbin orbit. And one interesting thing you'll see about it is, while it doesn't have translation thrusters for RCS, it does have some RCS thrusters to help you maintain stability. And that is because this delivery vehicle has a tendency to somewhat randomly yaw and pitch. And so those thrusters with RCS enabled will help me with the use of SAS keep steady. So this is a design that I probably couldn't have flown without a pilot. And Bill and Bob were along for the ride because I wanted them to get some more experience. I wanted them to level up because they're both still level 0. So we don't need to see the entire orbital insertion and transfer into the plane of, or into the Minmus orbit, or well, Minmus sphere of influence. I'm sure you've seen this before. I enter orbit, I align my my orbital plane with that of Minmus, and then I burn towards Minmus, or towards the location where Minmus will be when I intersect it, and I get an encounter. So, yeah, you've seen this before. So here we are, about to encounter Minmus, and as you can see, I'm flying by very quickly. I'm barely even being affected by the gravity of Minmus, which has low gravity as it is. So it's very easy to get these very quick flybys of Minmus, and yeah, it's not as easy to get those nice, really close encounters like you can with the moon, both because the orbital inclination makes it a little bit more difficult, and because the sphere of influence is smaller, and also just because the actual gravity of Minmus is very low. It's much lower than the moon's. So what that does mean, though, is that after you've established an orbit, it is easier to then land. So I've gathered a crew report, which is some extra science. My mission was simply to do a flyby. And don't worry, the Kerbals will return later, because they have to discover whether or not Minmus is as delicious as it looks. They suspect it might not be, but some Kerbals think that that's just pessimism, and that of course it will be entirely composed of some mint-flavored desserts, perhaps ice cream. Although Kerbal scientists aren't sure how it could be composed of ice cream when it's on average the same distance from the sun as Kerbin, since then it should have roughly the same average temperature as Kerbin. And of course ice cream melts most places on Kerbin, so that doesn't seem to make sense. Now here it seems like my retrograde and prograde markers kind of lied to me. As you can see, I was sitting on the retrograde marker, but when I fired, I seemed to actually be firing prograde, and I'm not sure if there was a problem maybe with my enhanced Navbal mod, or if it was a bug, or if the fact that I'm still technically just inside. I think it was actually just that I'm actually just barely inside the sphere of influence of Minmus, and I didn't quite exit it, which would be why the orbit is still this yellowish brown and not blue. So be careful of that. Make sure that you actually transfer from one sphere to the next before you trust the retrograde and prograde markers. There we go. And you'll see that as I do this, I actually don't keep this maneuver node. The reason for that is that I find that sometimes for especially simple maneuvers, the maneuver nodes are actually a bit of a distraction. I set them up so that I know roughly what I'm going for, and then I'll just burn and watch my various indicators, in this case periapsis. So I'm trying to get the periapsis down into the atmosphere. And normally for return, say from the moon, I'd probably get it down to, 35 to 45 kilometers. But here I actually go for 68 kilometers, which is pretty high up. In fact, it's so high that I get almost no aero braking effect. But there is a reason for this. And remember that if you want to drop your periapsis, your most efficient place to do that is at apoapsis. And the reverse is true. If you want to change your apoapsis, you should try to do it at periapsis. And so here I'm warping in towards Kerbin. You can see one of my satellites that I did for a contract flying around. Here I'm tracking, there's a moving planet, and I'm not sure which one it is. You can see, or maybe it's an asteroid, I don't really know. You can see it just above Kerbin. So here I come in. Here we go. And so now what I do is I point retrograde again. I'm going to start firing. And the reason I'm doing that is I want to kill some of my excessive speed here. You can see I'm over 3 meters per second, or 3 kilometers per second. And the reason I'm going so quickly is because I'm dropping essentially straight back towards Kerbin from the height of Minmus, which means that I pick up a lot of speed. And so I wanted to kill some of that off before I got into the atmosphere, because I was worried that hitting the atmosphere at that speed would be a little more dangerous than I'd like. Because I would prefer not to have to, kill Bill, Bob, and Val. I'd like to keep them alive. So as I'm here with this high speed, I start bleeding a lot of it off. I bring my periapsis down, so you can see it's getting down to 34.7 kilometers. And so I feel like since I've dropped it below 3,000 meters per second, that it's much safer. And now I'm trying to drop my vertical speed. If you look up to the top right, it's a little hard to see, but you can see it dropping down. And the reason I'm doing that is because I would like to sail through the atmosphere on my ablator for longer, rather than simply dropping down to the ground. Because sometimes when you're going particularly fast, you have a lot of energy to bleed off. If your vertical speed is too high, you will not be able to slow down quickly enough to deploy your parachute safely, and then your entire crew will die. I've had it happen. It's not a whole lot of fun. And so what you see me doing is trying to keep my vertical speed down, but also keep my periapsis height at around the, 33 to 35-ish range. And so as it starts to go too high or too low, I'll go back and forth between burning directly retrograde or starting to burn up. The closer I go to vertical, the higher my periapsis goes. And to some extent, you can even get it to go positive. So you're actually approaching your periapsis, which I did do there. And that's okay, because, again, my key thing is I want to get rid of my vertical speed. The horizontal speed, well, actually, I want to get rid of horizontal speed by burning through the atmosphere. To do that longer, I'm going to get rid of my vertical speed. So you can see that I'm actually going up a little bit at this point, but that's okay. And so while I'm doing that, I was trying to kill off my vertical speed here. And you can see that I'm already down below 2,000 meters per second. And at that point, it's pretty safe to drop through the atmosphere on your ablator. And now I'm just using up the fuel in my fuel tank, because if I don't plan on recovering the fuel tank, which in this case I do not, there's very little point in me saving it. I'm not going to get that money back. So I might as well use it to help my descent and make it a little bit safer. And I checked my contract, and that contract was good, so I definitely made a nice, tidy little profit on this mission. You can see that my apoapsis height is down below 50, and my periapsis height is negative 530 kilometers, so yeah, I'm not coming back. And there I go for separation. And I'm going to start flying this capsule down. Ideally, I'd like to keep it over the land. But of course, one thing to remember is that when you see the ballistic flight path on the map, that's assuming no further acceleration or deceleration, including because of air resistance. So it assumes that Kerbin has no air, but of course it does. And so it's always going to, your intersection with the planet is never going to be as far out as is listed in the map before you actually impact. So in order to try and make sure that I stay over land, I point the capsule's nose towards the horizon, which flattens out the capsule, because that will give me body lift, which will increase my my ratio of distance horizontally to distance fallen, basically changing my glide slope. Because at this point I'm gliding through the atmosphere. And here we go. Looks like I'm going to easily be able to get this to safely deploy the parachute. My target for parachute deployment is 250 meters per second. Below that, it's generally safe, as long as you're low enough in the atmosphere. If you happen to be below 250 meters per second, high up in the atmosphere, don't deploy the parachute, because as you drop through, it won't be able to provide enough drag to slow you down, and then it will be destroyed. So that's a nice little tip. You'll see that even fully deployed, I'm actually still coming down pretty fast. That's because it's not just the capsule that this parachute is slowing down, it's also a reaction wheel, lots of solar panels, and a heat shield. And so in the next time I use this setup for a capsule, I actually add some radial parachutes. Because yeah, I'm still at around 10 meters per second, which is really fast for landing with parachutes. And it actually turns out it's too fast for my ablator. So that's my ablator blowing up, which means I lose the money I spent on it, which I would rather not have done. But the important thing is the Kerbals are safe, they've returned the science, and now the Kerbals are ready to consider another trip to the moon, because someone would like to place a flag. So I'm going to get back in and recover, head off to the moon. So nice 56.5 science earned, that's not bad. Alright, got money for parts, and there we go. We get 3 experience gain for Bob and Bill and for Val. And remember, I took them for the experience. Here we are at the moon. So this time we've got Bill, Bob, and Dilly, who is a pilot, but not one of the first 4. And the delivery vehicle for this Moonlander was the same, with the exception of the very top stage, which you can see here. So I didn't feel like I needed to show you another virtually identical launch. But as you can see, I have unlocked the 2.5 meter storage bay. So I've got a bunch of science in there. And this lander design is designed so that the radial parts that you see with small fuel tanks and landing legs with fuel lines, those will detach when this leaves the moon. So we'll get to see that in a bit. It's a nice way to make it easier for you to return to Kerbal. But right now, I am beginning my burn so that my orbit will start to intersect with the surface of the moon. So remember, to come back down to the ground, you want to fire retrograde, which will slow your orbit down the fastest that it can for any given point in the orbit. There we go. So I don't want to land on the dark side, so I decided I'm going to wait a little bit and then come down. And my goal is to land in the crater that I'm actually basically over right now. So by making a plane change, and then having my intersection a little bit east of the crater, I should be able to come into the crater as the moon rotates. Because remember, the moon is going to rotate under you, not as quickly as Kerbin, but it still will rotate under you. So wherever you have your intersection point is not where it will be when you actually get down to the ground. So, setting up this maneuver node so that I can take advantage of the rotation of the moon and land on that crater. It's actually not very easy to, from orbit, pinpoint a particular location. You know, when actual space agencies like NASA or ESA or even the various companies like SpaceX do things, they've got guys with, you know, lots of calculators and computer programs and things like that do this. But for me, playing Kerbal Space Program, I'm basically just flying by the seat of my pants. Well, not technically, since that's supposed to mean that I'm flying based on how I feel like the aircraft is handling, based on how the forces that are being applied to me by the seat. So, obviously I'm sitting in a desk chair that applies essentially the same forces. But you know what I mean. Metaphorically, I'm flying by the seat of my pants. And so I'm essentially intuiting how to do this. I find that's a little bit more fun, actually, is to just kind of wing it and see how it goes. It results in a lot of failed missions, most of which you don't end up seeing. But, it's also a lot more fun when you get things right. At least for me. I don't know, I'm not an engineer or anything. So that's me, almost out of fuel on that poodle, but not quite. So I do a little bit of warping just to see how the crater is lining up with my planned trajectory. Because if it doesn't look like I'll be able to make it, I can make an even more dramatic plane change or something like that. So here I am. I think that at this point I'm probably set up for a good intersection. So I'm going to make my final burn for landing before I start my suicide burn. And I don't technically do a true suicide burn on this mission, but I do something that's pretty close. I wait quite a while before I actually burn. So there we go. That poodle's done. So time to use the next poodle. So the next stage also has a poodle. And here I see that I am dropping my speed. I want to drop it more to get into that crater. So each of the large each of the large craters on the moon tends to have its own biome. So there's actually unique science that can be done in each one, which means you should try to visit them all. The moon is a really good source of science. It's relatively easy to get to. Actually, it's the easiest place outside of Kerbin to get to. It's not the easiest place to land, but it's relatively easy to land, and it has a lot of biomes. So during that period where interplanetary missions are still a bit of a challenge in a career mode save, you're going to want to go to the moon fairly frequently, because it's a reliable way to get additional research done. Of course, it always helps when you have a mission to go there. So here I am getting ready for a suicide burn. And basically I'm trying to figure out which window it's in. Because I remember it not being super intuitive where it was. And yeah, actually, my initial attempt at the suicide burn didn't work out too well, and it was actually kind of boring to watch, so I cut it out. So now you can see the science payload that I have inside that that storage bay. Now, when I attached these goo canisters, I just attached them to the side and rotated them using the, I think it was the Q and E keys. And that actually made it so I couldn't access them from the inside. I tried that a lot and it didn't work. So if you do that, remember that you're going to have to hit the kind of struts that attach it on the outside. But I do a lot of experiments, and now it's time to get out. And my contract was to plant a flag on the moon. And once again, we get what I'm still going to call the contract Kraken. I suspect that what's actually happening is that there's some weird interplay between the mods that I have installed. I don't know that that's the case, but I strongly suspect that it's the case. Because yeah, when I put down the flag, up until I actually finish typing it, I don't realize that this contract seems to have just disappeared. My guess is that it disappeared from launch, which is, I believe, what happened last time. But either way, it's nice to have flags on the moon, and even without the extra money from this mission, I still end up getting a lot of science, because all this moon science is really good. So we go, for science and money. Sure, we had a contract to go here. Oh, sorry, sure we had a contract to go and plant a flag, but we learned stuff too. And I hit OK, and then, yeah, no contract. So, once again, the contract Kraken strikes. But, time to get back. And here you get to see that I'm not very good at using my maneuvering thrusters on in gravity. I actually find it rather challenging. And also, there's this kind of persistent physics bug, where sometimes you'll do something where you kind of fall off of the spaceship, and you will just shoot to the ground. Much faster than the gravity of the body you're on would seem to indicate you should. Like right there. I just fell way faster than I should have. Not sure why that is. But that's okay. My real problem, I think, is that I've got my hands on the W, A, S, and D keys, and by the time that I get the prompt to grab, I haven't quite moved my hand off of them. My finger wants to stay on D. But anyway, I get back in, and I do a check to make sure that the side fuel pods don't have any fuel left. Then I jettison them. And I do that because I will get a higher thrust with a lower mass. So I don't plan on landing back on Kerbin on anything except the capsule. And those legs don't have any engines under them, so they're completely worthless to me. Except that I need to land on them because they provide me a more stable landing platform. But now that I don't need that, they can just go away. Now, if I had landed roughly on the equator of the moon, this would be a simple return to Kerbin. Basically, once I was on the side of the moon directly facing Kerbin, I would just burn prograde until my periapsis with Kerbin dropped down. Because if you're doing that, if you're going in a prograde orbit, so an orbit that goes from west to east, and you get to that point where basically the moon and Kerbin are aligned directly through your spaceship, and you fire prograde, what you're actually doing is dropping your orbital velocity relative to Kerbin. Unfortunately, because I was not in an equatorial orbit, it's a little bit more complicated than that. As you can see, while firing prograde, that drops me into more and more polar orbits around Kerbin, and only slowly does it drop my periapsis. But it's okay, because I still drop my periapsis, and so this burn is still going to work for me. But just know that the further away from equatorial you are, the less efficient that's going to be. And eventually, if you are in too steeply inclined of an orbit, you may have to actually make a plane change, either before you do your final exit burn from the moon, or as part of it. You can try to combine them into a single burn. The single burn is going to take a lot of delta V, but, you know, bring extra. So, here we go. About to start my escape burn from the moon. There it is. So you can see how quickly the orbit changes, and that's because of the low gravity of the moon. So, pretty soon I'm going to break from an orbit into an escape trajectory. There it is, escape trajectory. And good. Well, I overshot a little bit, but that's not terribly important. Now, it is a problem that my periapsis has basically dropped onto the planet's surface. That's not great. So what I do is I go to my apoapsis and I select a correction burn. Now normally if you overshoot a maneuver you can just turn around and fix it, but I felt like while I was still in the moon's sphere of influence, I wasn't actually doing it most efficiently, and I could do it more efficiently at the at apoapsis. Because remember, the most efficient place to change your periapsis is apoapsis, and I was not at apoapsis while still in the moon's sphere of influence. So just a slow thrust. I got myself a 46 kilometer. I keep doing that. 46 kilometer periapsis, which is plenty for some nice aerobraking. But first, it's time to collect this science, because the experiments are not going to be coming home. They're going to be staying in space. Now, it's true that space has no objective up or down. However, the camera in Kerbal Space Program does. And I find that it's easier to do EVA things if my spaceship is facing up and down. So I start pointing my spaceship in a way so that, according to which way is up and down for the camera, my spaceship is roughly vertical. Looks like I already have an EVA report from high in space over Kerbin. So it's time to send someone to retrieve all that science. And as you can see here, I'm much better doing EVA maneuvering without gravity. At that point, basically it's just Newtonian physics. And when I'm this far out on an orbit, even the differences between the orbit of my Kerbal and the spaceship are going to be pretty minimal. So remember, I can't actually click on the goo canisters from inside. However, if my Kerbal is close enough, even if he's inside, I'll still be able to collect the data. So I click on the outside and collect data that way. And he does have to get the pressure from the other side, as well as get the other goo canister. So there he goes with the other goo canister. Now it's time to fly around. And it's nice the 2.5 meter storage bays are big enough for a Kerbal to actually enter. The 1.5 meter bays are not. So, of course, it's also easier to collect science if you're next to it because the entire bay does not extend as far. But it might be an interesting experiment to see what would happen if you returned to Kerbin with a Kerbal in a storage bay and not in a actual capsule. I'm not even sure if the game's clipping is accurate enough to keep him in there. He might just fall out. But either way, it is time to return to the crew capsule because the science has been collected. As long as I can find which side the door is on. Because I can never seem to find the door on these 3-man Mark II capsules. But it's going to be somewhere, right? And there it is. And I've got too many experiments. One thing I do wish would happen was that it would let you choose which experiments you were going to dump and which ones not. And really what I should have done was included a radio antenna on this so that I could radio back crew reports and EVA reports, because of course those give you 100% of the science even when you transmit the data. Whereas most other experiments, well, all other experiments, do not give you 100% of the science. But alas, I forgot not only lights, but also a radio on this particular mission. So, there was no talk between the astronauts and Richard Kerman, the President of the United States of Kerbin, or whatever. Yeah, I know, that was an Apollo 11 reference. So, because the Apollo 11 astronauts did speak to Richard Nixon. There was a bit of a delay, but they could hold a conversation. And here I am on re-entry, and once again I'm using the last bit of my fuel. And also I have the service bay doors open. Now the reason for that is that with them open it increases your drag. So really the point of these storage bays is that they are able to contain all your unaerodynamic parts inside of a sleek, round container. And so it's easier to get out of the atmosphere. But on the other hand, when coming back, you can use the open bay doors to your advantage to slow down more. Which is, of course, precisely what I did while still using my engine. But once the engine is done, it's time to use the ablator. And so I do. Now, this descent was not... It's going to be a very gentle descent, but it's going to be a very long descent. I basically just didn't plan it quite as well. And so I don't lose nearly as much speed as I would like to on this aero braking pass. So it actually ends up taking a few passes. But on the other hand, if you're worried about the safety of your crew, more passes is usually safer. So in a science game, I was once trying to rescue who was just Jeb from Minmus, where his ship had fallen prey to the gyro Kraken. And so his ship basically didn't have any heat shielding at all. And so I wanted to make sure that it was as safe a re-entry as possible. And so I went for a very shallow periapsis. I believe it was above 50 kilometers. So that way, over the course of successive passes, I would bleed off enough energy so that as I was coming down with my probe with no heat shielding and just a bunch of parachutes, and his capsule, which had lost its ablator, that I could still come down safely with minimal heating. Because you can actually survive some heating with your capsule. It's not like any amount of heating will just destroy it. But on the other hand, it can't survive nearly as much as the ablator can. And while the ablator is going down, it actually prevents significant increases in parts above it. Or sorry, temperature increases. So the ablator is very important. And if you don't have it, you do need to take one of these return trajectories like I'm taking, where you take some multiple passes and try to bleed off that speed slowly. So, and as you can see, I'm rapidly approaching my periapsis of 40 kilometers. And once you hit your periapsis, you're going to start coming back up out of the atmosphere. And that's what's going to happen, I believe, unless I'm completely wrong about this and this is a different mission I'm thinking of. Which it looks like it might have been. Yeah, sorry, I've recorded a few versions of this, and I guess I was talking about the wrong one. Oh well. Can't get them right all the time. Also, I shouldn't have left such a delay between flying this mission and recording this, because I left a, I think, 2.5 day gap. Yeah. So, note to future Tim, don't do that. But anyway, here we are coming in over the ocean. We are going to splash down. And while I do always recommend against splashdowns, if all you have is a capsule, it's really not that bad, as long as you get your speed down to a reasonable amount. Below the crash tolerance of your parts, basically. So, I may end up looking for a mod that reduces the deadliness of water, and actually maybe even makes it safer than land. I don't know. It's part of the Kerbal space program that kind of bugs me, is how dangerous it is to land in liquid compared to how much safer it is to have a splashdown in real life than a landing over, land. I mean, until the space shuttle, NASA's capsules pretty much always splashed down. That was just what they did. In fact, you can see a lot of footage from the Apollo 11 recovery, where, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins were all in the return capsule. And, the helicopters went and got them and put them from there onto a ship where they were brought into quarantine just in case they came back with a moon virus or something. Which was a concern. It wasn't... NASA didn't actually think it was very likely, but they decided to play it safe rather than sorry. So they did put all three of them into a quarantine, and they vacuumed out the return capsule to make sure that there was no more moon dust. And it wasn't until they were quite confident that there were no moon viruses that the astronauts were allowed out, and that samples were allowed to be, you know, just handled without basically biological hazard precautions. And we now know that essentially the only pathogens that could possibly be on the moon are ones that have been introduced there by humans. So that is no longer a concern for future moon missions. But it is interesting to note that it was a concern for Apollo 11. Also interesting is that the guy on Apollo 11, Michael Collins, who everyone forgets about because he did not land on the moon, he shares a name with a famous Irish military leader from the Irish War for Independence and from the Irish Civil War, Michael Collins. So he is kind of a national hero in the Republic of Ireland. And as far as I know, there's no relation between the astronaut Michael Collins and Michael Collins, the early 20th century political guy. Just a little bit of trivia for you. And here we go. It's looking like I might make it to the land, but I'm not going to. I'm trying to stay with my nose pointed right onto the horizon so that I can use that body lift to help get me to the land, but I'm just too far away. So you might be thinking, Tim, how do you know so much about Apollo 11? And the answer is because before I recorded this, I decided to look it up. Yeah, this is not all just stuff I have off the top of my head. Sorry. I do have a reputation for knowing a lot of stuff, but it's because I look things up. So now you know. That is how I know so much about the Apollo 11 mission. Including who Michael Collins is, because I could never remember. But then, this past semester, I took an Irish history course. And so now I know who Michael Collins is. And because the Michael Collins from Apollo 11 shares a name, suddenly I'll be able to remember him. So. But this re-entry, as you can tell, it's even without doing multiple passes through the atmosphere, it's still a pretty shallow re-entry. As if you look at my retrograde marker, it's barely above the horizon, which means that my vertical speed is not very high. I'm going mostly to the side. You can even tell that visually, where the ground is moving below V, and I'm not really moving up and down in relation to it, at least not visually. And here I'm coming out of the heating phase and into just the supersonic phase where I'm Mach 2. And I find that basically once you get out of heating, that's about when you can deploy drogue chutes. Unfortunately, the ship doesn't have drogue chutes because I haven't unlocked them. But as you can tell, it has more parachutes than the previous capsule that had otherwise the same design. So the only difference between this return capsule and the previous one is that it has 2 radial parachutes, just to protect that ablator so I can recover the money. And recover the money for the parachutes, too. There we go. Parachutes deployed. And Bill, Bob, and Dilly are now en route for a safe splashdown. And the Kerbals will not be putting Bill, Dilly, and Bob in quarantine, because they are quite confident that there are no moon viruses. Yep. They have decided that Kerbals don't really get sick much anyway, so it's not much of a hazard. But this additional science will allow them to get farther and farther out and look at the other worlds in the Kerbin system. It's still an open question. Do any of these other worlds have life? Are any of them habitable? Do they have perhaps other civilizations? Are Kerbals alone in the universe? These are all questions that have not been answered by the Kerbals yet. And they are questions that they are going to try and find answers to by continuing their space program and going to the moon, going to Minmus, maybe going to Duna, maybe Eve, who knows? But for now, the Kerbals are just happy to be back. Well, almost back. They still have about 200 meters to go. So I do sort of wish that I could slightly adjust, maybe bring down the drag on the parachutes, because this descent is starting to be gets a little bit almost painfully slow towards the end. And if I could reduce, say, like the big parachutes drag by, you know, I don't know, 20%, I feel like I could have gotten down just as safely and also more quickly. But I guess it's not terribly important. Anyway, here we are back at the Kerbal Space Center with 392.8 science earned from that mission, and with Bill and Bob both going to level 2, and Dilly getting a whole whopping 5 experience. So, that's all for me. Thanks for stopping by.